Welcome, welcome, welcome to another episode of Your Next 50. Ladies, we are here to tell you that it's your time. Be intentional with your choices. Don't waste even one more day hiding behind your stories. You can reclaim your personal power and be happy while doing it. And this podcast will show you how. I am so happy to be here today. We have a lovely guest, by the way. I am Sylvia.
And I am Jenny, and welcome if you're listening in for the first time, for the 50th time, or perhaps even for the 66th time. It feels very ominous. And we have a wonderful, beautiful face between us, Sylvia. Who is this gorgeous lady?
Welcome, Anita Nowak. I know Anita, from days at McGill. I believe you were a student there and a professor, but we're going to let you introduce yourself today, Anita. And we have a great show all about how the world needs more purposeful empathy. And Anita's I like to call her the Canadian Brené Brown. Am I allowed to do that, Anita?
Yeah, I've been asked a question by a student once, when will you know you've made it? And I said, if I ever am on a stage with Brené Brown, that'll be the moment. So you couldn't possibly pay me a higher compliment than that.
Wonderful. So tell us a little bit about yourself and this work, how you got into purposeful empathy.
Sure. So it's actually a little bit of a story because I was doing my PhD at McGill in the Faculty of Education, and I was interested in media literacy long before social media was around. So like, how do we learn about ourselves in the world based on a very mediated culture? And it was at a midway point. I'd finished all my courses, and I finished my comprehensive exam, and I took a year off to actually take on a professional challenge as a fundraiser. And I said to my thesis advisor that I wanted a year off just to focus on the work. And he was really against the idea. And he said, Anita, this is where all the attrition happens. You stay with it. And he said, come see me in 6 months and let's talk. So 6 months later, I was in his office. I had no agenda. Things were going well professionally. I knew I was going to come back to the PhD, but he said, what's new? And that summer, I was going with my sister to Kigali, Rwanda. We were going to help an organization with a microfinance project get lifted off the ground. I was very excited about this trip. And he stopped me and he said, look, Anita, he goes, I'm telling you right now, you're lit up like a Christmas tree about this trip, and you're not lit up the same way about your thesis topic. And the only way that you are going to finish your degree is if you are as excited about your topic. So then he gave me advice. He's like, go home to the box or the drawer or the folder where you stuff into it and you don't pay attention. He goes, find it and pay attention to what's there. He goes, I promise you've got a passion topic that you are not aware of. And I left his office and I was like, what is he talking about? Like, how dare he question my thesis topic? Yeah. And no joke, 2 weeks later, I got over my ego. I was like, okay, now I'm curious. I wonder, do I have this thing that I don't know that I have? And sure enough, I'm going through my filing cabinet. I get past the taxes. I get past this. And I came across a file that was marked miscellaneous it's my handwriting, but I was not conscious that I had this. And I opened up the contents, spread it across the dining room table. And I was like, okay, I don't see anything in common. I see stubs from a talk that I attended with Stephen Lewis. And then there was some newspaper clippings about this, that, and the other. And finally, I came across this little article. It was a boy in Ontario who had gone to school without wearing shoes for a week because he'd learned about childhood poverty in the global south. And he wanted to know what that felt like. And he wanted to raise awareness among his classmates. And that's when I noticed that all of the things that I was naturally attracted to were people trying to create positive change in the world, agnostic to what it was. It could have been health, could have been climate change, could have been homelessness. Didn't matter. And I had no idea this thing on the ascension called social entrepreneurship or social innovation was a thing. So then I found this beautiful, group of people called social entrepreneurs. And to Michael's credit, to my thesis supervisor's credit, I changed my thesis topic. And I was like, okay, well, now I'm going to devote my time to interviewing social entrepreneurs to understand why they do the work that they do. What do they have in common? And all the interviews pointed to every single one of them without exception to this one concept of they saw a group of people who were disenfranchised or facing some kind of discrimination or suffering in some way, and they felt a compulsion. They needed to act on the empathy they felt. So I ended up developing a pedagogy of empathic action. That's what I called it. And I've literally been spending, I've devoted the last 10 years of my life to understanding how empathy can be deployed for personal, organizational, and social transformation. And, I give him credit for, having given me that feedback all those years ago, because I know that I'm on my path, because I'm just so excited. I want to read the next empathy book. I want to, be engaged in this work forever.
I love that you delved into, and your professor saw that, what lights you up. And we talk about that all the time, because the energy is so different, is it not? And we become magnetic when we light up like that. And you light up, definitely, Anita. Watching your TED Talks, you were a speaker, and you've been awarded 2 times Teacher of the Year at McGill and Professor of the Year. So that is a true testament to what you're doing. I love this. And Jenny, this is your sandbox as well. We talk a lot about compassion, don't we?
Yeah, we sure do. And really excited about that. As fundraisers, as leaders in the not-for-profit space, we're always trying to engage empathy. But what you're inviting is an even more elevated kind. I wonder if you could tell me, for those of us that are new on listening to this, to hear the word social enterprise being bandied around, could you provide us with a definition of what you see a social enterprise being?
Yeah, and I want to provide a definition for social entrepreneurship and social innovation, because they're different in my mind. Yep. So we all know what a traditional entrepreneur is, right? So they're trying to solve a problem in the marketplace with a product or service, and they've got all sorts of, skills and talents to make that happen. A social entrepreneur uses the entire array of tools that a traditional entrepreneur would use, but instead of selling products or services for a profit, they're really looking to solve a social problem or an environmental problem. So that's what a social entrepreneur does. Social innovation is in the ecosystem of social change, but social innovation is looking at it from a systemic perspective. So, sustainable food systems across the entire pathway. A social innovator might look at seeds all the way to food security and try to change the system. Like what about the system needs to be updated so that there's more sustainability or more justice along the entire continuum. So a social entrepreneur is fixed on a specific solution, and social innovators are looking at the problem and the innovation across the system.
Fascinating. And from my world, I am more familiar with the term social enterprise, which is a not-for-profit that has some kind of a for-profit arm, which has the goal of generating revenue, but also supporting the community that they serve. For example, Crackers here in Ottawa has a catering business which is tied to the Ottawa mission. So providing quality food, but also retraining those gentlemen, usually gentlemen, a lot of women too, with services and tools so they can go out and, teach a person to fish rather than, giving them the fish firsthand. So you've elevated me already on some of my language. This sector's changing. I mean, you're talking empathy. Brene Brown just started. She started a couple of years ago, and you mentioned you were excited about the research. What's possible in the empathy research field in the next, let's say, 3 years? What do you think is going to happen?
I just had a conversation with Christian Kiezers, who's a neuroscientist in the Netherlands, and he and his wife have a laboratory. He was part of the original team in Parma, Italy, that discovered mirror neurons. So let me just take a second to just explain what that's all about. We used to think, these are his ideas. As neuroscientists, we used to think our brains were a lot like computers, right? Where we have like files and there's an operating system and we could like save things and put them away and organize them. It's like we're not anything like computers, the way our brains operate. And we're very interconnected across human beings. Like there's we're neurally connected across networks. And the first pathway to that, or the first opening, was the discovery of mirror neurons. There was this group of scientists that were using macaque monkeys to do some neuroscience. And they, literally by accident, one of the little monkeys was still tied up makes it sound really terrible. But anyways, he was wearing the little hat. attached to the fMRI or the EKG, I don't know which machine it was, that was monitoring the brain activity. And they noticed that the brain of the monkey watching another monkey eating was lighting up the same way as though that monkey was eating. So they're like, isn't that interesting? So they replicated it, and then they tested it across a bunch of other creatures. And ultimately they discovered that our brains work the same way. So in terms of motor movement, like if I wave my hand, you're watching me wave my hand, your brain is actually queued up to feel what it's like to wave your hand, because you know what that's like. Okay. So those are mirror neurons. Later in his research, he's looked at kind of like the networked kind of intuitive connection that we have, that it's not just about the motions of our body that we can connect with. We can literally feel things that we share in common through the human experience. So I find the neuroscience is kind of catching up a little bit with what the mystics and the sages
Yes, exactly.
so long that we're
all connected,
interdependent. We're part of this one family. And I, in my conversation with him, I didn't want to push him too hard on this, but I believe that empathy and purposeful empathy, so empathy on purpose, is political by nature and spiritual by nature. It's political from the point of view of like, if you're acting on empathy for others intentionally and you're designing for policies, for example, that are empathic, it's political because it's challenging the status quo, saying like, we want more justice, we want more peace, we want more sustainability in the world, and the way things are going right now is not serving us all. But it's also spiritual by nature because it really, the definition I like to use for empathy is that it's the innate trait that unites us in our shared humanity. And if we're empathizing with someone, we recognize that we are all living this, human experience together. We may not have the same lived experience, so you can't know for sure and for certain, exactly what someone is going through unless you're projecting, and that's not really a great idea. But we do still at the baseline say like, hey, you're alive. I know what it means to feel pain. I know what it means to feel hope. And so empathizing is that kind of gateway for us to share that. That's why I call it like humanity's biggest superpower, this untapped resource that we could just, crank the volume up on and see change.
I love this. And it reminds me, and when you said it was spiritual as well as political, I was like, yes, like we are all connected. And I love what you say also about like, we're born with empathy. Babies from a young age. And I look at my children, like my daughter coming home and her friend got hurt. Well, she was crying and she just felt that so bad. And I didn't have to explain anything. She just came home and felt that way. Where do you see, with everything, I feel the world is at a crux at the moment, and we live very much for ourselves. And social media does this. The social distancing is not helping in the world that we're living in today. How do we get out of that me to that life of service and interconnectedness?
Well, first of all of the social media is designed to keep us addicted, right? Doom scrolling is a real thing because the dopamine hits that we get from, the likes and whatnot, like they're designed on purpose to keep us hooked. So we have to put those away. We have to literally stop using social media more often. There's an expression, touch the grass. It's really important that we actually find ourselves in the outdoors and reconnecting to nature, which the word awesome actually comes from awe and comes from this idea of like, look how splendid the world is. And we need to find opportunities as often as we can to reconnect to this state of awe that is available to us. And, when it comes to the interpersonal relationships, it's just super easy because it's more familiar to us and maybe less work to just kind of go about our conversations and just chit chat about whatever's top of mind, newsworthy or whatever. But actually, there are ways in which we can really connect as human beings intentionally. And to really, I have an annual Ode to Soup gathering, and everybody who knows they come, it's women only. We have a speaker, we bring some soup, we collect some money for a shelter. But walking through the door, we're not going to talk about the weather here. We're going to talk about what really, really matters. And it actually is truly soul food. So one of the things I do with my students every semester so that they understand how rich it is to actually feel connected to somebody. We do a 2-minute eye gazing exercise, which is
Yes.
super uncomfortable. People do not like it. They feel completely vulnerable.
Yeah.
But in the debrief afterwards, it inevitably comes up that they're like, I feel like I've really been seen.
Yes.
And I feel like I know my partner. Like we never said a word, but I know that person better.
Yeah.
And it's just like this beauty that's available to us, but we're just so busy rushing around in our lives all the time. And social media is totally toxic.
It is.
That we need to intentionally build into our relationships and how we go about the world to feel connected and a sense of belonging.
One of the expressions I use sometimes with my my clients is be brave enough to have conversations that matter.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have to slow down, and it starts often with a check-in, but it's being curious. It's asking that next question, and trusting you don't exactly know. Like, look, I've been there. I've got a huge to-do list, right, Anita? And somebody just doesn't look quite right. And taking that moment to say, hey, what's up? Connecting and trusting that whatever comes next is the right thing, rather than boxing the sucker up and saying, I'll deal with that later, right? People are not to be put in boxes. And that the other word that really came up for me, which is something very personal, is shared humanity. We have to stop thinking of ourselves as humans living a spiritual existence, but rather spiritual beings living a human existence. And thank you for bringing those points up. Yeah.
Well, can I pick up on something that you just said, where you're like, you're with a colleague and you're noticing something's off and you take a minute to ask? I mean, it can even be amplified. I'll tell you a story. So when I started understanding brain plasticity and the idea that we could become more empathic with practice, I started to actually experiment with that. And I had this experience at the FedEx at Place Ville-Marie here in Montreal, big office tower, 10 years ago, before we all had phones to distract us. So I'm in a long queue. It's like this time of year where I was going to send a parcel to the mail for the holidays. And it was half an hour before I got up to the counter. Everyone in the line was like bored and stressed and annoyed. And the woman who greeted me was, for no apparent reason, really rude, like really rude. And I remember having the reaction of like, yeah, you think you can be rude? Like you can one up, or like, let me speak to your supervisor immediately. Like I'll have none of this. Yeah. And that nanosecond kicked in where I was like, oh, okay, maybe this is a moment I can practice empathy. And so I got really still and I asked her, are you okay? And she took a second to discern whether I was being sarcastic.
Legit.
Right? Yeah. And then she heard that I was being sincere and she just burst into tears. She said, I've been working double shifts for 2 weeks. My son is home with a sinus infection. I'm getting sick. It's 3 p.m. I haven't had a lunch break. I'm just flat out exhausted. And we held the space for one another. I still have goosebumps, even though I've told the story 100 times, where, we just chatted, two strangers chatting like human beings. I've been there. We've all been there. And she had the chance to kind of just feel validated and heard in her complex situation. I couldn't fix it for her, although I remember getting her a mint tea
sandwich.
But she then got her composure back and then, went on with, sending my package with full of grace and full of top-notch customer care. And that experience has stayed with me because I am not a perfect person. I am a work in progress, and I will still be rude to people sometimes when I'm stressed and all that. But I try wherever I can to show up as an empathic person. And the result of that trying has been that my life has improved.
Yeah.
I've become a happier person because I'm engaging with the world with more empathy. And so that's the thing I wish people understood is there's so much evidence on a physiological level that when we're stressed, there's cortisol running through our body, right? We're in this chronic state under the pandemic of being anxious and stressed and overworked. And so our bodies are not actually able to be as empathic as we would maybe like to be. So one of the practices that's a kind of on-ramp to empathy is gratitude. Because our brains can't be in a state of stress and empathy simultaneously. No. So when you're stressed, if you want to empathize and be present for someone, one of the ways to do that is to just take a moment and think, oh, I'm grateful for this. I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that. And then all of a sudden, your heartbeat stabilizes. All of a sudden your immune system's functioning better. There's different hormones that are going through your body when you're in a state of gratitude. Endorphins start to kick in, all these feel-good hormones. Then you can be present for empathy.
Yeah.
And so if we learned to do that and we learned to channel that, I mean, we would live a happier, healthier life. But then, imagine that aggregately.
I think we've been talking about that even the kids are learning this in school now, the gratitude piece. And I have journals with my kids. What are we grateful for today? And they're like, and then they list all their foods that they ate. And, but it starts really young. And that's when we know, as a lot of moms out there, a lot of parents listening to this, it does really start. The children have it in them. And along the way, people, other people's anger gets in the way and shows different actions. I was listening to you, and it's all about choice. In that nanosecond, Anita, you chose differently. You did not choose to make it about you. You were actually, letting your curiosity come about and say, hey, here's a hand, take it. Whether she takes it or not, that's up to her. And maybe some people won't, but not to let that stop us. And I love that, because it's all about choice. Our whole lives are a reflection of our choices. We can choose to be angry, or we can choose to, lend out that hand.
And that's why I kind of emphasize the purposeful empathy, because empathy is actually made up of two phenomenon, and they don't happen simultaneously. It can be one or the other. So I'll unpack that for a second. One is called affective empathy. It happens to us, and it's a emotional response we have to like a stimulus. And it really is thanks to our mirror neuron system. So like I typically, when I do a talk, I'll put up a picture of a kid who's like she's 5 years old and she's smiling. She's like so happy. And you naturally, your facial expression resonates with it, right? Yeah. And then I'll turn the slide to this kid who's like having a meltdown, crying. And you can't keep the same facial expression, right? So that's like an emotional resonance that happens to us. So that's emotional or affective empathy. Cognitive empathy, on the other hand, is something that we choose to engage in, right? By perspective taking. It is the neocortex that's busy at work saying, I wonder what that's like for that person. I wonder how I would feel in their circumstances. And so we tend to, as we've evolved as humans, we have this bias naturally, which is an inhibitor to empathy at a large scale. Like we think, we empathize with people who are most like us. And that's by design, because of how we've evolved as humans. But the idea of you want to transcend that inherent bias to be able to, have empathy for other people that are not part of your in-group, to create a better society and a more just system and better public policies. So I do emphasize the purposeful empathy, taking advantage of the fact that it's our brains that we can leverage and not let just, the emotion happen to us about, but that we can engage.
Do you think that empathy is like a muscle that I'm thinking of my super feelers in my family, right? The people that take on those mirror neurons, that lands really tight for me, Anita, taking on other people's emotions. Is it like a muscle? Like, I'm sure not all of the leaders you work with are incredibly born empathetic. Can that muscle be stretched and grown?
Yeah, 100%. Also can lead to compassion fatigue. So I would really like to talk to both. So on one hand, what I find super hopeful is that we all have neural plasticity. So that means we can think different thoughts and behave in different ways and change the composition of our brains. So, when we're born, we don't have a lot of synaptic connections. We don't have a lot of neural connections because we haven't experienced much. So there's quite a bit, there's no density in our brain in terms of the mirror neurons and all of the neural connections. But as we grow up, we've started living life and we've had more experiences. So just like, if you're walking across a football field full of freshly fallen snow and you're the first one, your snow prints are very entrenched right across the track. But if a bunch of people follow you and follow in those footsteps, a track develops where it's not about the footprints anymore. It's that there's a pathway, right? That's exactly how our brain works. The more often we experience something, the thicker our neural connections become and our synaptic connections become based on a set of experiences that are lived over and over again. So if you're born into a family where there's a lot of strife and stress and conflict, your neural pathways will develop differently because you need to develop a mechanism to defend yourself from whatever's happening in your home. the corollary is true too. If you're born into a family where there's lots of love and peace and harmony and nurturing of compassion, your brain is going to develop differently. So you might meet somebody as an adult who's a defensive person by nature, pretty guaranteed that there's something in their childhood that would have led to that. But that doesn't mean that you can't become more empathic.
Right.
So you can actually, through neuroplasticity, rewire your brain for more empathy. And that's what I meant by taking these like experiments, like the, FedEx woman, but then all over the place, I was trying to be more empathic, and I'm sure I've kind of rewired a few things. So yes, just like going to the gym and doing your bicep curls is going to lead to bigger biceps. You can become more empathic with practice. That said, there are occasions where you're over empathizing and you're running on a low battery. Mm-hmm. So if we look at like sort of a natural bell curve of people, like the empathy range, most people will need to recover from a really kind of traumatic conversation they've had, even though they may have not experienced the trauma themselves. If they're listening to a friend who's had a mom who's dying, for example, or something's had lost job, you'll need to recharge, right? And so you have to have practices so that you can regain your homeostasis and then go back out into the world and be empathic again. But there are actual professions where there's a constant demand on your empathy, right? So all the healing professionals,
nurses, teachers, I'm just thinking, right now.
All of them in this moment, God bless them all. So it's no wonder that they can't be constantly empathic all the time because they're just overwhelmed by the demand on them. So they suffer a lot from burnout and post-traumatic stress and secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. There's also a group of people called the empaths. Now, I'm not talking about the regular people in the bell curve. The empaths are people who are highly sensitive to like energy in a space and the feelings around them. So they'll walk into a room and they'll know.
They'll feel it.
They'll feel that there's tension or they'll feel something. Yeah. And as they're talking to people, they might not even need to hear what's going on in somebody's life, but they'll feel like, oh, that person's going through a hard time. Yeah. And that can be onerous as well. Yeah. So the practice of self-care and self-compassion and finding ways to recharge your battery are so important if you want to sustain your capacity to be empathic in the world.
Well, as well as as a leader, I'm just thinking, Jenny, we talk a lot about leadership, and as a leader, are you aware of this in your own teams? Are you taking the actions? Are you saying the right things to allow your teams to share? And maybe they need time off. Maybe, rather than go, go, go. I've worked in teams where it's just go, go, go all the time. And that's what was expected. This is so interesting. Such a great conversation.
And you're also putting the onus on self-care on the leader themselves. So in order for them to bring their best self to work, it is their responsibility to know how to recharge, to own that time so that they can show up the next day and be empathetic. That's another takeaway, Anita, isn't it?
And that if they model that, then they can expect that from their staff as well. Like one of the great practices I just talked about, gratitude earlier, is you can start a staff meeting by going around and say, let's just say something we're grateful for. And, it sounds super cheesy, but even in the 2 or 3 minutes as a practice, we're all reminded that we're humans first before we're employees. And, people who have studied very successful companies and workplace cultures, like Pixar, for example, is one of the most decorated companies, visionary creatives, and they've studied their culture, and they have what's called social cohesion. And they have social capital between the team members, where they actually have embedded in their work practices ways for the colleagues to, like each other, hang out together, become friends. When you build trust, you can have a miscommunication that gets resolved way quicker than if you don't actually fundamentally trust somebody and then it balloons into something like hostile, right? Yep. So all these practices that allow us to see each other as full human beings in our vulnerability, in our complexity, actually serves, and there's a big business case for innovation, productivity, presenteeism, absenteeism, all of that.
How about recruitment, right? Like renewal, finding new people rather than people leaving the team, them staying, the cost to businesses. So one thing that's coming to mind for me is, how will corporate America, the corporate world, need to change as this new generation of people, this kind of new awareness of empathy, the kinds of expectations of, let's use my dad, at 75, of the company culture, toe the line, show up no matter what, give, even if you're deathly ill or sick or whatever. It's not possible, is it? It's not tenable in the new world we're talking about with real human empathy. What's next?
Well, I mean, the Great Recession is calling so much attention to that. People just like, I'm done. I'm not whether it's you're working on a factory line or driving a 18-wheeler, or you're working as an executive for a giant pharmaceutical company or a consulting company, like, people want to feel appreciated for the work that they're doing, and they don't want to feel like they're giving them their best selves to their job, which is at the end of the day a paycheck, and people feel replaceable. So I think that there's a zeitgeist where we get it now. There's also like the meta zeitgeist of like the way we're doing business, given climate change and given the social inequities that exist. Like, we have to reevaluate all of that. And the new generation, it's like, they take it for granted. I'm not going to work for a place that's toxic. I'm not going to work for a place that doesn't value me as a human being. And so if you want to attract talent and keep talent, all these well-being practices, all these practices that allow us to come as authentic selves matter to the bottom line.
How exciting.
It is very exciting, isn't it? And if I look at my, we all have young kids, and what is it going to be like for them in 20 years, right? Anita, this is amazing, this conversation. And I know you're a busy lady. You are writing your book called Purposeful Empathy, and it's coming out. I think we can pre-order the book, can we not?
You can pre-order it. You just go to my website, anitanowak.com. It's free to pre-order right now because it's only coming out in the spring of 2023. Really about a pathway for personal, organizational, and social transformation. As I said before, empathy is our superpower. It is our most unused superpower, and it's a renewable energy. So we should take advantage of it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Anita. And for those of you listening, it's Anita Nowak, and her last name is spelled Nowak. There's also a really cool YouTube channel that she has if you want to check out her stuff there. And again, another fantastic and thought-provoking, really thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation today. As I think about the rest of my day, Anita, how can I make sure I'm connecting with my own empathy for myself and for my teenagers in my house? I'm just going to say it out loud. So without further ado, what have we got coming up next on next week's episode, Sylvia?
Well, talking about spirituality, we're having our guest, Cassie Billets, who is a coach, and she's going to be talking to us about bringing spirituality into our lives. So kind of a spirituality one-on-one, and she's going to delve into her various practices. So it's a great, this talk has been a great lead up to that. It's perfect. Yeah. So that's going to be a great episode. We have an episode every Wednesday. It drops every Wednesday. So please subscribe. And if you love this content and guests like we have today, please share with your friends. Who do you see perhaps at this moment in time who might need a little empathy, or, just share this episode. Jenny?
Make their next 50 years even better, which is our mission here at Your Next 50. By the way, we have recently been trademarked. We're pretty proud of ourselves. Yay. Your Next 50 is now a brand, and look forward to telling you more about that as the weeks come on. So without further ado, everyone, Anita, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Anita.
Thank you.
And we can't wait for the book.
Everyone.
Happy holidays, everyone. And we'll see you next time on Your Next 50. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.